listening to TMI for the week of May 14th, 2018.
This week on the show, I speak to Brennain Lloyd of Northwatch. Northwatch is a regional coalition of environmental organizations, community groups, and individual members in northeastern Ontario. Northwatch is a member of Mining Watch Canada, Nuclear Waste Watch, and the Ontario Environment Network. How comfortable are people with, expanding our dependence on nuclear?
Well, I think in Northern Ontario, we're not expanding our dependence on nuclear. We're generally, because of the way the provincial grid is operated in some times, at some times of the day or some times of the year, if you could track those electrons, we might actually be getting some power from Southern Ontario. But overall, we are regionally self-sufficient, even as it is, and we have been for as long as we've been looking at this.
Yep.
We have potential to do better in Northern Ontario as you do in Southern Ontario. There's a fair amount of uptake on renewable energy. There's a number of larger projects, both wind and solar. And we've always had some large hydro projects. I think what's more interesting and more important is that there has been interest and uptake in smaller projects at more local level. Mm-hmm. I think that there have been difficulties accessing the grid. There have been difficulties in, and I have only anecdotal, understanding of this, but there have been difficulties with projects being brought forward, and they can't be accommodated on the grid. There's, so there's been some real lost opportunities there. I think generally speaking, though, there's an appetite. There's an appetite for change, and certainly there's no appetite or little appetite. I'm sure you can always find it in some corners, but generally speaking for the general population, there is not an appetite to be nuclear dependent. I can say that for Northern Ontario, for Northeastern Ontario. I think you can say that for the whole province. I think that there's some kind of really troubling institutional momentum in the relationship between government and industry, between government and the nuclear industry, that keeps the nuclear agenda alive. But it's not rational, and it's not an agenda that I think has popular support. Mm-hmm. I think there's maybe a sense among many that that it's bigger than they can take on. But I think if we were able to unbundle that, and I think we would see that there isn't a rational basis for the continuance of the nuclear program, and certainly there's no rationale for the expansion of that nuclear program to Northern Ontario. Unfortunately, there are some interests within the nuclear sector who are promoting that very thing, and it would seem over the last 2 years increasingly with this notion of small modular reactors. And I think that is, we'll see how far this fiction and fantasy on the part of the nuclear sector continues. We'll see how much of our time and attention it's going to demand, but we're certainly, we've got an active file on it and are watching and responding to it with concern.
Well, if the giant plants aren't in the long term viable financially, tiny ones lack an economy of scale. So I think right there we're going to find some disappointment.
Well, and what you're going to have is if these small modular reactors, and they're only very conceptual at this point in terms of any description that the nuclear sector has been putting forward, but basically it's 5 megawatts to 300 megawatts, all of which is easily replaced by renewables alone, let alone a combination of renewables, conservation, and efficiency, which I will say this province seems to be really, as a province, seems to really be always leaving behind the conservation and efficiency potential. But those 5 to 300 megawatt generation needs or requirements, or whatever the industry wants to call them, can easily be replaced by other sources. Yeah. And what it's going to do, it's going to have all of the risks and hazards of those nuclear technologies dispersed, and you're going to have that waste generation dispersed and continued. And, a small amount of nuclear waste is a very, very, very large problem.
Yeah.
And why at this age we would even entertain the idea as a society of creating those nuclear waste generating stations, because that's really what nuclear power is. Nuclear power, it creates electricity as a fleeting benefit, and you are left with the gift of nuclear waste into perpetuity. To disperse that across the province, across the north, and also to increase proliferation risk would increase in tandem, and it makes no sense to any reasonable thinking people. If you're a nuclear supply company, if you're a nuclear consulting company, there's always been a few have made a lot in terms of the dollars that the nuclear sector demands. But from any rational or public interest perspective, it makes no sense.
Proponents seem to be perfectly okay with seeing nuclear waste trucks on Main Street.
Well, I think they can make more money from that as well. I mean, we look right now at the program the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is delivering. Their expenditures are, tens of millions of dollars a year to basically run a public relations program with a small technical program on the side, which is mostly literature reviews. And they're spending, tens of millions of dollars, and have been for a decade. They're up close to $100 million at this point, because their budget began at $50,000. It was going to increase steadily every year of their operation, and they've been up and running for 11 years now. So they are spending massive amounts of money, and so some are making money. It's ratepayers' money and taxpayers' money they're making, but some are making money.
And their general message is nothing to see here.
No problem here. Look over there.
There's upcoming hearings. There's Bruce refurb hearings, and you were at Chalk River. Did you go to the Chalk River hearings recently?
That's right. We were at Chalk River was in February.
Yeah.
I believe it was February. It was winter.
Yep.
Chalk River was in the winter. Bruce Power is the end of May, and Pickering is the end of June.
Right, Pickering. I screwed that up. You will be going to the Pickering hearings?
That's right. We're going to both the Bruce hearings and the Pickering hearings.
What is the latest at Bruce with the OPG DGR?
Well, so just as background to that, around 12 years ago, Ontario Power Generation moved into an environmental assessment, a federal environmental assessment process of a proposed deep geological repository, a DGR, in which they would go down 680 meters into the limestone beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station, less than a kilometer from the shore. The shaft, the entry hole shaft, will be less than a kilometer from the shore of Lake Huron. They started that 12 years ago, the environmental assessment, and they took a number of years to generate the shelf full of binders that house their environmental impact statement and supporting documents. And we went to a hearing in 2013 in September that was then extended into October and then was extended into 2014. And at the end of that, the Federal Environmental Assessment Review Panel released their report. It went to the Federal Minister of the Environment. She requested additional information. So Ontario Power Generation, despite the number of years and the thousands of pages in their environmental impact statement, brought an incomplete project to the hearing. So, some fundamental design issues like how are they going to cap the shaft into this underground repository? Still not completed. And then in the course of the hearing, fundamental questions arose which they weren't able to speak to, like, how's that rock at deep surface moving? It is moving. How's it moving? How are the pressures changing? What are the upward pressures, downward pressures? Couldn't answer that. So the minister required additional information from Ontario Power Generation. It was information that they should have provided in the environmental impact statement, and then the panel asked them in written questions to provide, and then the panel asked them again to contract consultants to do additional reports, and they still weren't answering the question. And then the minister asked them, and one of the questions was, what will the cumulative effects be, or what could the cumulative effects be when you combine the effects of the Ontario Power Generation proposed deep geological repository for low and intermediate level waste with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's idea that maybe just one town down the road, they will have a deep geological repository for high level, the fuel waste, irradiated fuel waste. So Ontario Power Generation did another attempt at not answering this question, did a cumulative effects report by name at least, and the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation wrote to the minister and said, Minister, we're doing our own review, and Ontario Power Generation can't do a legitimate cumulative effects assessment without the information that we are, the assessment that we're doing. And so the whole thing with OPG's proposal has basically been put on hold. Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is doing their own process, their own study. OPG cannot legitimately finish their cumulative effects assessment without having that from that input from Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And the minister says she's not going to make a decision until she is satisfied with the cumulative effects assessment and a number of other things. That's not the only other item, but that is the item, that is, the one item that we can specifically track, why it's in limbo. So it's in limbo. We, any day without a DGR is a good day.
Sure.
So that's fine. From our perspective, that's fine if it stays in limbo. The better outcome, of course, would be that the Ontario government would direct Ontario Power Generation to stop wasting time and money on that idea and just get serious about dealing with the waste in real time, in real place, right now. Because one of the outcomes of this is that of Ontario Power Generation pursuing this idea of, burying the waste deep below the surface is that they are really not doing the job they should be doing on managing the waste on surface. And that goes for the high-level waste, the fuel waste, which they have been saying for eons of time that they're going to bury it somewhere far away. And it goes for the low and intermediate level waste, which they, since around 2006, have been saying they want to bury deep beside Lake Huron.
It's insane. Well, it's great that a big wrench has been thrown into the works. The things that were brought out during those hearings, they had geological experts present, they had descriptions of the nature of the rock they'd be drilling through and a layer of rock below it with a very high hydrostatic pressure. The containers they were going to put into this thing may not survive just the loading of the repository itself. That in the first paragraph of the brochure that they themselves printed up to promote it, they admit that the canisters wouldn't last very long in geological terms, and the contents of the repository would be squished over time. Someone else talked about future glacial gouging. So even though it's 600 meters deep now, it might be 3 or less in the future when the geology itself is by nature unpredictable. You talk about the surface rock moving in directions, but the most incredible thing that I learned at those hearings was, and I think it's WSH 231. I think that's water. I can't remember what WSH stands for, but it's a water well they dug on site, and it had 50,000 becquerels per liter of tritium in it, which means that they're going to be shafting through a plume of tritium, taking those tailings and putting them on the surface for however long it takes for them to do something with this tritium. And of course there's water runoff, and there's all kinds of things that go on during the digging of this hole. But they're digging through a nuclear accident.
Yeah, and these sites, Bruce, Pickering, Darlington, they're all contaminated sites. We know a bit more about the Bruce site because of, the information that came into the hearing on the proposed deep geological repository, and those tritium plumes that were discussed at length in the hearing are related, are mostly assigned to the waste site on the Bruce site, to RWS 1 and 2. But it sort of gets painted by OPG as, well, it's a historic problem, it's a legacy, it's contamination back from the bad old days. But the bad old days continue. The irradiated fuel bays at these stations are also releasing radionuclides into the environment, into the groundwater. There's tritium plumes, certainly at Bruce and certainly at Pickering. At Pickering, those tritium plumes are related to the irradiated fuel bay and its failures.
Wow.
And interestingly, at the Pickering site, OPG will not provide groundwater monitoring results for the interior of the site. They'll provide the groundwater results only around the perimeter of the site. But of course, the irradiated fuel bay is identified as the source of these tritium, this tritium contamination, and it's in the center of the site.
I think I read a presentation by Frank Greening saying that the pits below the Pickering reactors are the most contaminated, samples we have in our country. That it's a national disgrace.
It's a contaminated site, and what OPG wants to do now, well, I would have said, they were to shut the reactors down for 2020. Now they're pushing to run them to 2024. And what OPG wants to do is then defer not just decommissioning. There might or might not be an argument for deferred decommissioning, but there's no argument for deferred decommissioning planning. So OPG now wants to go. They've got a preliminary decommissioning plan, they call it, which is very limited in the information it provides about the site conditions or how they would approach decommissioning, what the required end state, how cleaned up that site would have to be. It provides very minimal information, but then they say they don't want to actually have to provide do the detailed decommissioning planning for decades. Which is, completely unacceptable. We should have the detailed decommissioning planning should have started long ago, and it should be right now. We should have full public access to all the information available about conditions on that site.
Particularly because the cost of decommissioning speaks to the real cost of today's electricity. So by deferring those estimates, you're continuing to delude us on the actual price of nuclear power.
That's right. And those reactor communities, they were, I'm sympathetic to them in the sense that I feel they're being sold a bill of goods. You know, they were brought online to support the reactors and support the reactor continuation and so on, and they were always told that the waste will go away. Speaking of the high-level waste, the fuel waste, well, the waste isn't going away. A, because there's nowhere for it to go. B, because there is no certainty that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization will ever be able to secure a site that does not have really strong community opposition. There's no evidence that they'll be able to achieve that, and there's no evidence that a deep geological repository for irradiated fuel waste can actually effectively contain those wastes into perpetuity, which is the test. That's what it's got to do. And if it can't do that, then it's then it's it's just another failed dream on the part of the nuclear industry. But those reactor communities were told that the waste would go away, and now a couple of years ago, OPG started asking them how would they like to repurpose the site, how would they like to use that site in the future, as if there was not a huge challenge, and a challenge that they may or may not be able to meet in terms of being able to remediate that site. I have no expectation that that site is going to be remediated to a degree that it can actually be acceptable for any other use than an industrial use with limited access. And we won't ever know that until we know the conditions on that site.
Well, it sounds Orwellian. They won't study the costs and what's involved in figuring out how to decommission it, but they're ready to sell it to the public as a future park.
That's right, a future park. Come and play. Well, maybe not. And, and the regulator in Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they bear responsibility here as well. I mean, we have there is no robust, reliable set of rules that the public can look to and say, okay, well, if they follow those rules, we know that they'll clean up the site to a point that it's, that it's safe. We don't have those. Maybe 20, I'm guessing now, I think it was 2015, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission came out with a discussion paper on waste and decommissioning. Nothing since then. There's a discussion paper from, now years old. We don't have in Canada a definition of what an acceptable end state would be. What's the level of, and we don't have any sense of the level of contamination would be, and I don't think that there is any, any reason to assume that we have the technical or scientific means to actually clean up that site. How do you remove tritium from groundwater?
That's been leaking for decades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We know these. We know some of the challenges of this when mine sites have become contaminated with, with heavy metals or, other kind of toxic materials, and it's a very, there's a very, very limited ability, even with other contaminants, to actually remediate after that contamination has taken place.
Yeah.
So
I'm wondering if there's a push to go ahead with the Bruce refurb go-ahead before we get the final price tag for the Darlington refurb. Am I just being paranoid?
No, I don't think that. I don't think that's paranoid. I think that there's all kinds of reasons that there's all kinds of reasons why the neither of these rebuilds should be going ahead. We call them rebuilds. They used to call them refurbishment. Now I think Bruce is calling it major component replacement.
Right.
I think they have to change the terminology every 5 years or so, because when too many eyes come upon it, best just change the terminology, and maybe people won't notice for a while. There's lots of reasons to not go ahead with either of these refurbishments. I mean, one is it doubles the waste in the long run, because you have the refurbishment waste, which is in refurbishment waste, it's classified as intermediate level waste. But only because in Canada our classification system for radioactive waste is low, intermediate, and high. But that intermediate level waste can be as highly radioactive as high-level waste, but it's only called high-level waste if it's irradiated fuel waste, if it's those fuel bundles that have been in the reactor and gone.
There's reactor cores and reactor components and calandria tubes, and they're just as radioactive as...
Just as radioactive. So they're called intermediate level waste, but that's really I think we should probably start taking the time to say highly radioactive intermediate level waste.
Well, wasn't there intermediate A and intermediate B?
Not generally. It's not those terms generally aren't. I'm not familiar with them.
When I never see, I look at these hearings as the smoke, and where there's smoke, there's fire, and we certainly don't hear much about it in the news, what they're actually spending, because they go ahead with these on-site buildings, like tritium recycling or tritium, they're trying to take tritium out of their release stream.
Tritium recovery, I think they call it now.
Right. But they go ahead with all these projects on all of these various sites. We don't hear about it in the newspaper. I know it's not part of our cost of electricity, 100% of it. I've never seen a totals list for public spending related to nuclear, maybe on a year-to-year basis. It would be very interesting to see it go up and down as they greenlight these projects. My point is like, it's one thing to put a price tag on the Darlington refurb and maybe whatever they're going to do at Pickering and what they're about to do at Bruce. But what about what they've already done at Bruce? They've already done lots of work at Bruce in years past. And Point Lepreau. We never see a totals for the nuclear policy in Canada, because I'm pretty sure if you took the amount of electricity produced and you sort of divided it by the amount of money spent in these hidden and deferred costs, the ones that we don't assign directly to the price of the electricity, this thing would be over in a week.
Yeah, well, and I think that we certainly can never account for what the future costs are going to be. The NWMO says that the Deep Geological Repository for Intermediate Level Waste will be $16 to $24 billion. But those are, of course, their 2005 speculations on what the numbers might look like. They're not going to be real-time numbers in by any stretch of the imagination. Same with Ontario Power Generation said $1 to $2 billion for the Deep Geological Repository for Intermediate Level Waste, but those were their, best case, 2011 estimates. And
the last time I heard there was an estimate for the Yucca Mountain project. Last I heard in adjusted dollars, it was like $90 billion.
Yeah.
You're saying 1 to 3.
1 to 3 is the number they use for, and then 16 to 24 for the fuel waste repository. And the other thing that doesn't get factored in there is the the lost opportunity cost. So the reality in Canada, or in Ontario, not in Canada, the reality in Ontario is that when you're running these large nuclear plants, you're occupying a lot of space in the grid. And that prevents other projects which would have lower costs, higher employment, more economic benefits from coming on the grid. So it's not just that these are extraordinarily expensive and going to demand more money for centuries and centuries to come. It's that they're blocking other opportunities, economic opportunities now.
Yeah. What led to the 1988 formation of Northwatch?
Well, prior to '88, we were we're a northeastern Ontario-based organization, and we had two different networks. There was a network of peace, disarmament and development groups called the Northeastern Ontario Network for Peace. And then there was a caucus of environmental groups who generally organized themselves as a Northeastern caucus of the Ontario Environment Network. And both those networks were active. In 1985, so there was always some of the groups who worked on nuclear issues were part of the Peace Disarmament Development Network, and they were also part of the Environmental Network. In 1985, there was a military training corridor announced for Northern Ontario, and it was going to have B-52 bombers who would be delivering the cruise missile, that was in the era of the cruise missile was the next step in the nuclear arms race. They were going to drop down just north of North Bay and fly this arc literally across northeastern Ontario. Timmins dropped so North Bay, Temagami dropped to 400 feet. Fly that arc at 400 feet up, basically Timmins, Wawa, out over Superior. And that brought the environmental groups into the same discussion as the peace and disarmament groups, because this military training corridor was going to have real environmental impacts on, forest health, wildlife migration habit patterns, even on, potentially on agricultural uses, land uses, livestock, and so that brought that discussion a little closer together. And then, so sort of through the mid '80s, we had these two overlapping networks. And then in 1988, started in 1987, we were having these. We would often have regional meetings, and we would have Saturday was the environmental network, and the Sunday was the peace network. And then 3 or 4 months later, we'd meet again and we'd flip. One was on Saturday, the next Sunday would be on Sunday. And then in 1987, we knew that there were two very large governmental processes coming. One was the class environmental assessment of timber management on Crown lands in Ontario, which was a provincial hearing which went for years on how logging and how is done and how logging roads are constructed and how forest management plans are made. That was going to be a really, really big process, and it was going to affect the interests and the concerns of much of, not just of our membership, but people more generally. And then there was another. That was provincial, and federally there was a Federal Environmental Assessment Review Office was starting an environmental assessment process of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's deep geological disposal concept. So basically ACL's idea about how to bury nuclear waste, and it was Northern Ontario was the map they were looking at. And it was in many ways very similar to the idea being promoted now by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And that was going to be a long, large process as well. And we just saw that we were all volunteer, local, community, district-based groups. And we were really going to have to share efforts if we were going to have any kind of a voice in those exercises, in those processes. And they were very important to us and could potentially really have outcomes that could really affect our region. So we created Northwatch, and Northwatch is a coalition. We have both member groups and individual members, and Northwatch was created to provide a representative regional voice on environmental concerns. And we're a coalition of environmental and social justice and other social organizations. So, groups like cottagers groups and trappers councils don't necessarily identify as a social justice or an environmental group, but they have concerns in common with those areas that Northwatch focuses on: healthy forests, healthy lands, healthy waters. So we created Northwatch to basically represent us in those processes. And that, I think, is in part why Northwatch has continued over the decades to still engage in these things like licensing reviews by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and environmental assessment hearings. We went through the hearing of ACL's burial concept was a 10-year review. It went from 88 to 98. The hearing on the Timber EA went from 88 to 94. These are long processes, but they're important. So we created Northwatch to have basically a means to express our regional interests and concerns from an environmental and social justice perspective in those processes.
I noticed on your website, I think I read somewhere, that one of the things you looked at in the early days was the links between the military and commercial uses of nuclear.
Yes, and that continues to be, a concern, I think, certainly of Northwatch, and I think that there's no separating the origins of the military applications and the civilian applications of nuclear technology. And I think that the proliferation risk continues with our continued use of nuclear technology to, boil water for electricity. And it will expand if we ever saw development to something as silly as small modular reactors. But yeah, it's a concern. And, sometimes people say, oh, Northwatch, are you opposed to nuclear power? And I say it's that I would describe it that we do not support nuclear power, the use of nuclear power, because it's expensive, it's risky, it's impractical, and it creates large volumes of waste we'll have to safeguard into eternity. So we don't support nuclear power. We oppose it because of its links to the military and the proliferation risks.
Yeah,
so,
and AECL CANDU has always been trying to export its reactors to basically anywhere that will take them. And I'm also hearing that they helped countries buy it. So they also gave financing to both India and then later Pakistan. Their little arms race there. Nobody ever wants to talk about that. And all the places.
Canada has.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Canada has supplied the reactors in those cases. But Canada does more than that. Mm-hmm. We don't limit ourselves to providing the technology. We also provide the fuel. Yeah. Cameco mines uranium in northern Saskatchewan. Yeah. And we're all agog and gleeful a few years ago because they signed a major contract to provide uranium to India. And we tracked that uranium to India and found that the uranium Canada is selling to India will go to a single facility in Hyderabad. And in Hyderabad, that single facility processes uranium both for military and civilian purposes. And we wrote to Brad Wall and we wrote to the Prime Minister and we said, how are you tracking this uranium? How are you ensuring, or how have you been assured that this uranium is not going for military purposes when it goes to that Hyderabad facility? Mm-hmm. And we got back just a booster letter from Brad Wall, the Premier of Saskatchewan at the time, saying, it's great, it's really, really great.
And just a backgrounder for listeners, so Canada was exporting CANDU technology to India. Then India exploded its 1974 bomb test using Canadian-derived technology. So we had a trade embargo that Harper was nice enough to lift a couple years ago, and is it in terms of the chronology? And now it turns out you guys are finding that the uranium's going to military reactors in India again. So is that right? I mean,
yeah. Well, from what we were able to determine, the uranium was going to the Hyderabad facility, and it's a single facility that serves both military and industrial users.
Nuclear.
And we also wrote to the CNSC, and no one refuted that. So we wrote to the CNSC and to as well at the time, and no one has refuted. That was, now of course, this is what we find in the course of, maybe a day's research.
Wow.
So we were open to being corrected. I would have liked to be corrected. Please correct me.
Well, you were corrected. Everything's great.
Yeah, everything's great. But no one ever refuted that the Canadian uranium was going to that Hyderabad facility, and we know for a fact the Hyderabad facility serves both military and industrial users. So, sometimes there are occasions when you would really wish to be wrong, and I would have wished to be wrong in that occasion, but unfortunately, no correction came.
With the U.S. Lake Erie side and the U.S. Lake Ontario side, and then all of Ontario's nuclear reactors just surrounding us in every direction, we're surrounded by plants, mine sites, storage sites, and forgotten dumps. Is that too negative?
No, I think that's just a statement of fact.
It's, for someone like me, that's like Ontario has a horrific stigma. I have a hard time being proud of Ontario when I wonder if we're more surrounded than other areas. I mean, in every direction, there's, like I said, it's either a forgotten dump, a mine, a temporary storage site, Port Hope cleanup site, incinerators burning nuclear waste.
Yeah, so I think in terms of nuclearized jurisdictions, I think we are second only to France.
Again, all these things that I learned at the OPG-DGR hearings, there was a paper released by the CNSC that showed the content of the effluent that comes out of the smokestack on behalf, I think, of nuclear waste.
Yeah, well, we have an incinerator at the Bruce. The Western Waste Management Facility operates an incinerator for radioactive waste. We also have an incinerator at the uranium refinery in Blind River. So Cameco, in addition to mining in northern Saskatchewan, they run a uranium refinery at Blind River, and then a uranium conversion facility and a fuel manufacturing facility in Port Hope. So in Blind River, we have the world's largest uranium refinery, and they have an incinerator there for radioactive waste generated at the refinery. But they also now incinerate. They bring all of the combustible radioactive waste from Port Hope, from both the conversion facility and the fuel fabrication plant, and they in fact had a backlog at the fuel fabrication facility because Zerkatech used to own it, and when Cameco took it over, there was a backlog of radioactive waste there, and Cameco ships those wastes to Blind River for incineration.
You can't make this up, folks, and they call this green and clean. Even the name nuclear.
Yeah.
It's
not clean.
You can't make this up.
Not green. No.
Like it's I want to say evil. Like and the people who are the proponents, their working jobs, their unionized jobs, they're all doing quite well, I think, at it. And it's just so cynical when I try to put myself in the position, would you throw grandma down the stairs to save your job? I mean, because, they're defending an industry with, an unsolved waste problem, an uncalculated cost, nuclear waste all over the place, one way or another, and they burn it, and we get to breathe it, and it's okay. It's got to say something about the human condition, that we're okay to ignore certain things.
Yeah, well, here's another interesting aspect of it. In other industries, so certainly with the forestry industry and the mining industry, Northwatch has a difference of opinion with, the decisions and the activities of those industries in many cases. But in most cases, we also have an ongoing discussion about how to do things and how to do things better or differently, or and it's kind of a conversation of increments, and there's a diversity of views within those industries, and the diversity of practices, and so on, and it's a dynamic discussion. With the nuclear industry, it's a bit different, because there is not a dynamic discussion about should we or shouldn't we, which is the fundamental question in the nuclear sector. Should we or shouldn't we?
Well, that brings me to another question. How? Because here's what this maps onto what you're talking about. Because another way of putting it is, these CNSC hearings have very strict mandates, but in reality, the decision, should we or shouldn't we, comes down to some weird. It's almost an invisible split between. It's almost like the federal CNSC side of the decision and what appears to be a provincial side of the decision, where anything to do with radionuclides seems to be delegated to the CNSC, but things like, and a lot of these are absent, how much it really costs, what are the alternatives, why are we doing this, the geopolitics of it, the military implications of it, the waste and ethics implication, the First Nations implications. There seems to be this split between the decision making, and one is very narrow on the CNSC side, and then there's all these other issues which seem to fall provincially.
Well, and I think it's even yes, but a little. I think maybe a little as a detail to that. The decision test for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in approving these licenses, when you read the decisions, I won't get this word for word, but basically there's two parts to their decision. Is the licensee qualified to undertake this activity? So is OPG, do they have the qualifications? Are they experienced at running nuclear reactors? Well, they've got some experience. And the second part is, and this is a part I might not get word for word, but is the activity likely to cause significant adverse effects? And that's sort of time bracketed. So it almost is up to someone or anyone to prove the case that it will have significant, and what's the definition of significant, adverse effects within the time frame of the license. Now, I would say that the fact that it's going to generate, another 20,000 bundles of irradiated waste, so another 100, over the course of the operation, or it's 20,000 a year on average from Pickering, that's a significant adverse effect.
Yeah, well, that waste is going to last 20,000 or 200,000 years, and that's well beyond the span of the license. So
I would say the generation of that waste is a significant adverse effect in itself, in and of itself, but the CNSC does not. So the decision test is faulty, because they're sort of, the questions are too vague and large, and B, because CNSC's interpretation of them is too generous to the interests of the nuclear industry.
What is absent is the side of the decision-making process that looks at the other, whatever's outside the scope and mandate of the CNSC hearings. That whole chunk, it seems invisible. Like you might see it at Durham Nuclear Health Meeting or some sort of very small sliver of it covered in some other forum, but that's it. It seems to be, and they'll say it's a political decision. I mean, that's the best I can get in terms of how it's framed, in terms of should we, or what's the real cost, or there's no public hearings for that side of the decision.
No, there's no public hearings on need or alternatives. Those are the hearings that have been regulated out of existence.
Right.
There's a regulation saying we will not have an environmental assessment of nuclear expansion in Ontario, and fundamental to an environmental assessment is that you look at need, alternative, cumulative effects. Those are the three special things that you look at in an environmental assessment. And in my view, you cannot make a good decision on any project, whether it's a new project or a project continuance, if you don't look at need, alternatives, and cumulative effects.
Right. Another thing, because you guys don't focus just on nuclear, you're into lumber and mining and water quality and all kinds of stuff, but the battle always seems to come down to a corporate liability. And so an example here in Ontario, they, after years of having a $75 million cap on liability for nuclear accidents, they finally raised it to $1 billion. But just the Port Hope cleanup got $1.3 billion. So already we can see it's inadequate. Then when we look at the Lac Megantic, just for example, the first thing you do is you just bankrupt in the first couple of weeks to avoid liability. That's what these corporations have a playbook. Once it gets too dirty, they have techniques to evade liability. So there's obviously this hole in fairness when it comes to holding polluters responsible in the long term for their actual damage.
Yeah, well, it's quite right. I mean, you think about the Adams Mine dump. So from 1999 to 2004, we fought against Toronto sending all of their garbage to an abandoned iron ore mine in North Temiskaming District. And, despite all of our good arguments and the technical critique and the evidence we had and were able to present that it would be, damaging to both ground and surface waters and all of that, despite all of that, in the end it was liability that killed it, because neither the proponent nor the City of Toronto wanted to accept the liability. They both wanted the other party to take the liability. And in the end, that's what killed the deal, was liability, because there wasn't a Nuclear Liability Act, which is, the Nuclear Liability Act. It's about nuclear, it's the Nuclear Avoiding Responsibilities for Liabilities Act, where the industry has this cap, and above that cap, it's the public purse picks it up. So they don't have to have insurance beyond that cap.
Well, these corporations, Westinghouse, GE, Cameco, whoever's not bankrupt to be yet, they just won't do business in countries and areas that don't have the Standard Form Nuclear Liability Act. And countries have very similar, there's some minor differences, but they're all basically the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
Your work is often directed at government. Approaching the election, past election upsets complicated Northwatch strategy?
Certainly, when you get an upset that results in a more, in a more regressive government, it upsets our work overall, because there is further deregulation. So certainly, the upset of a Harris government coming into power upset Northwatch's work, because we saw rollback after rollback of environmental law, environmental protection. if we saw a Ford government elected, I think that we would see the same, only even more so because we have not yet, as a province, recovered from the damages done by the Harris government of so many years ago. Certainly in the days of the McGuinty and the Wynne government, we haven't seen those environmental protections reestablished. And in fact, we've seen in the nuclear field, we've seen some further losses. For example, under the McGuinty government, a regulation passed saying that new nuclear projects, new nuclear reactor builds would be exempt from environmental assessment. So certainly who's in government makes a big difference to our work. Maybe not the day after the election, but certainly as the term rolls out. The tragedy, of course, is when you have a government elected that rolls environmental or social protections back, and then the next government doesn't reestablish those protections.
Here in the Toronto area, the message that he's sending out is it's curtains for our green belt. That can't be a good sign.
Well, it can't be a good sign. And in Northern Ontario, we've had difficulty establishing similar kind of protections. So in Southern Ontario, there's the growth bills are protective. In Northern Ontario, the growth bill is development oriented. So the Northern Growth Plan is all about development. It's all about doing more of the same, more mining, more logging, more of the same. So no, it's not a good sign when those precious few protections in Southern Ontario are being waved around as things that will be lost. For Northern Ontario, we can only expect to fare worse because we generally do. There are a number of different cases, a number of different examples where environmental regulations are already more protective in Southern Ontario than they are in Northern Ontario. Wetland protection, air emission standards. We've got two different provinces, Southern Ontario and Northern Ontario, on many counts. And if he's going after Southern Ontario, he will be no friend to Northern Ontario.
Industries and industrial operations that locate themselves up north they're off the beaten path and they're out of the view. And there's great spaces between industrial sites in the north. And I get the idea they can get away with more because there's less sort of prying eyes.
Well, a number of our industrial facilities are actually right in the center of the major centers. Timmins is a major center, and it's a major mining camp. Sudbury, the same. Sault Ste. Marie, the industrial center, is right in the in the heart of the city. I think the difficulty we have in Northern Ontario is those where we have an industry that dominates a community, a municipality, that industry tends to have a high level of influence. If you're in the city of Toronto, I'm not saying that industry doesn't have a high level of influence, but it's not a single industry. It's not a single sector. Whereas in Northern Ontario, if you're in a major center where the primary industry is mining, the mining sector will have a high level of influence on regulations related to their sector. So, and in some cases, certainly a lot of the industrial development is sort of out of sight, out of mind. Certainly a lot of the logging happens away from human settlement, or at least concentrations of human settlements, towns or cities or villages, and a lot of the mining does as well. But even when it happens in the center of a large municipality, there is a different relationship between that industry and its environmental emissions or outputs, and what's accepted in the community or the region at large, and what kind of pressures they bring on the provincial government to be more of a regulator.
Yeah. You have a reputation for being perpetually go, go, go busy. You were in...
Do I?
You do.
Well, I'm pretty busy.
You were in Sudbury recently.
I was in Sudbury yesterday for Northwatch's regional meeting. Our spring meeting was in Sudbury. And yeah, so we had people traveling in from a number of different districts, and we do our regional meetings 3 to 4 times a year. And our regional meetings, since Northwatch was founded 30 years ago in 1988, our regional meetings have always served to provide most of the direction to Northwatch's work.
Can you give us a bit of a background on the history of Sudbury? I mean, I remember even as a kid seeing the photographs of soot-stained buildings and all kinds of airborne pollutants. But I'm going to hope and guess that things are a lot better in Sudbury now with some environmental organizations taking aim over decades.
There are a couple of dozen active environmental groups in Sudbury, and Sudbury is different than the sort of the moonscape of the 1970s. A lot of that through the hard labor of the people of Sudbury, doing regreening projects, even going out and liming the rocks, which had been, stripped of vegetation through decades of acid emissions. The SO2 emissions are much lower now, and the stack is much higher, so that doesn't have the same impact on Sudbury as it is. And Sudbury is actually, it's a beautiful city. It's a very diverse city. It's got a large university, 2 community colleges. There's, I think, 28 lakes within the greater Sudbury area. It's a beautiful city, very active. I think some of the best cycling infrastructure in the north, and very active arts community, wonderfully bilingual community. It is still, even though it is more diverse economically than it was decades ago, it is still, in many respects, dominated by those large mining companies who are there.
How much does Northwatch interface with Indigenous populations?
Well, that varies day to day and issue to issue. I think, from our founding days, we've always had Indigenous people as part of Northwatch in a membership, because they're a large part of the population of Northern Ontario, and we have had working relationships with Indigenous organizations, from individual First Nations, tribal councils to the treaty organizations. We don't represent Indigenous people. Indigenous people and Indigenous peoples organizations represent their interests, but certainly we have those interests and those rights as part of our analysis. We are treaty people. We're all treaty people, and we live within the Robinson Huron, Robinson Superior, and Anishinaabe Nation treaty areas. So I would, that is formative in how we approach our work, and our work is informed by that. But we are we are not an Indigenous peoples organization.
You have a Twitter, a Facebook, a web page.
Yeah.
What do people need to find?
Well, I would like to say our website,
yes.
But I maybe can say that in a month, because it's undergoing a really, 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 really long overdue overhaul.
I noticed it has a weird name, and it was / Northwatch. So you want northwatch.com. That's what you want.
So northwatch.org is the domain, but it points to the website is actually hosted by Web Networks.
Right.
And so we use some fairly old technology. We go on and upload it with FFTP files, file transfer. So we're in the process of moving that over, and it will be easier to maintain and update. But right now our Facebook page is where we post the most, news and events posting. And a month from now, that will be, we'll have a feed into the website. So northwatch.org is overall the best site because it's got, it has background material, and it's currently under revision form will also have things like our briefs and submissions and those kinds of things. So it's a better resource overall, but in the short term, the Facebook page is more current.
Okay, and the handle on Facebook is?
Just Northwatch.
Okay, and you're on Twitter as well, I think.
As Northwatch.
Okay, that's easy. And you're updating your web page soon, and I really like the idea of having submissions and stuff to read, because they're always very informative. And you guys hire scientists and stuff.
We do.
Yeah.
So we get technical experts when we, in some cases, we just do reviews in-house. We don't, but in some cases we get participant funding and we hire experts and technical folks to provide us some of that assistance when we review.
Do you mess around much with the freedom of information process?
Not as much as we should.
Yeah.
We have not as much as we should, and not as much as, I keep expecting that we will. Some of our colleagues are more consistent at that, and we always enjoy what they find and forward, but we do probably only a few requests a year, whereas we actually, have an intention to do more, but it's a capacity question.
A difficult and expensive process, is it not?
Yeah, well, provincially, we have done more provincially, and provincially it's very expensive, very slow, very tedious, and in some of our experiences, we in the end haven't gotten what we requested, even when we paid hundreds of dollars up front and in advance. So I think the federal process, once you get in the, once you get sort of get the hang of it, I think it's not as arduous, but we have not used that as much as I keep thinking that we should.
Yeah. Binder. How much longer is Binder on the job at the CNSC?
We heard a date, May 8th was his final day, but we have not heard an announcement for his replacement.
Do you think anything will change?
I hope. I hope so. One of the things that we have really seen under his presidency is the CNSC has always been pro-industry, but it has become more, I think, more aggressive as a lobbyist on behalf of the industry under his watch. And we see things that, back in the 1980s, we used to see ACL do these things, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, but they were the industry. Now under Binder's presidency, we're seeing things like an article appears in the Manitoulin Expositor, and the CNSC replies. They tolerate no dissent. Article shows up, a letter to the editor, an opinion piece, a news story shows up in these small local papers across the country, and the CNSC is on it. And there's a letter from Michael Binder saying, you clearly just don't understand how wonderful the nuclear sector is.
So not only is that free PR, but it's just like a judge who comments
it's
on
inappropriate.
A case that's pending.
It's just inappropriate behavior. It is really inappropriate behavior. They also, we see an interesting trend that they send out news items. They have an email list, which I think they say they have 4,000 subscribers, which I'm surprised it's not more, because 4,000 is really not that many. They send out only good news
Yeah.
stories.
I was just going to say, it's
The
always
industry.
good news. Yeah.
It's always good news, and sometimes just because I'm always curious. Sometimes when there's a news story that isn't good news, I will forward it to the CNSC information office and say, "Here's for your list." Of course, it never reappears.
No.
And sometimes when they send around a piece that is particularly promotional, I'll reply to it and say, "Can you tell me your criteria for which news items get forwarded to your list?" And I've never received a response. And I think we'll see if that changes or not. Unfortunately, these practices can become institutionalized, and they're things that we've seen have come about under Michael Binder's presidency. We think they come from his leadership. We know through some of the access to information responses that some of my colleagues have done that there are certain activities that are being directed from the president's office, and they're inappropriate. We had, multiple CNSC staff signing on to Northwatch webinars. Sure, they're public webinars. You're welcome to come on. But isn't it interesting that the president of the CNSC is directing that? How much free time does he have?
Yeah.
So we'll see what changes. I am an optimistic person by nature.
There's a little off topic. I heard that. Do you remember Rod McLeod from the OPG DGR? He was a local lawyer. Yeah, he passed away.
He did, yes.
Yeah, that's awful.
He was with Save Our Saugeen Shores and with the Southampton Residents Group, I think. Yeah, he passed away a few months ago.
He made such great points and spoke so well.
Yeah. He was very strong on on some points about the panel's suitability because of previous statements or activities on some of the panel members.
He cited municipal board rules that were violated. He talked about that these deals are being made behind closed doors with no public notice.
Yeah. He quoted minutes from a I think it was a county meeting that Michael Binder had attended, and closed off the meeting by saying, "I'll see you at the ribbon cutting for the DGR." Now, talk about a pretty clear statement of predestined outcomes.
He pointed
out when the president of the Nuclear Safety Commission is saying it's a go.
Yeah, before the
hearing has even begun.
He pointed out that these local municipalities have been getting funding for decades.
That's right.
Before.
Yeah, through what they call a willing host agreement or the hosting agreement.
Willing host, meaning payments for complicity, so that if the little town council ever decided against it, the payments would stop.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and it was even more than that. In the case of Kincardine, the municipality of Kincardine, they had to show support for the Deep Geological Repository. So I remember during the Darlington new build hearings in 2011, the mayor of Kincardine traveled from Kincardine down to Curtis, just north of the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station, and made a presentation in support of the Darlington new build. And it really prompted me to ask him a question in the Q&A to follow. What role the hosting agreement and its requirement that he show support for the Deep Geological Repository, what role had that played in his decision to come and present to the new build hearing? Now, the panel did not recognize the question, and Mayor Kramer was not required to answer. But clearly, he was there because his municipality was getting a large amount of money on a regular basis from OPG to support the Deep Geological Repository,
and
including new build.
Yeah, anything that
Including
makes
new
more waste.
generation. Yeah.
Good Lord. Well, that's why we need Northwatch presenting at these hearings.
Well, I think public engagement at these hearings is really important. Sometimes we don't see the direct results of our efforts, but sometimes we do. I think it's important, and I think it's really important that there be local participation. Northwatch is a regional group in northeastern Ontario. We intervene in the Pickering and Darlington and Bruce hearings because of the waste they will generate. Yeah. It's really important that, local organizations and individuals participate. And it's important that people come and attend the hearings, even if they didn't make it onto the sign-up list in time to be able to present. It's really important to have, people out in those hearing rooms, listening and responding, if only with their spontaneous, gasps of surprise or, expressions of, delight or disappointment, as the case may be.
I notice the audience often claps after a great presentation. I know for myself that I think most of what I've learned about Canadian nuclear really has come from following all these hearings. We don't read about it in the paper. I learn everything
at every hearing. Yeah. I learn so much from the public interest interveners, and I am repeatedly so impressed by the quality of thought and effort and the intelligence that the public brings to these proceedings. They really, we're in good shape if we can get decisions made, passed back to the public hands, I think.
I think we need a royal commission.
I think that we need a real overhaul of the regulatory decision-making and electricity planning, and we need that overhaul to happen without the influence of the nuclear industry and the nuclear suppliers. And, that doesn't happen. You look at the lobbyist registry and you see why we have the problems we have.
If you took a poll of Ontarians and asked them how many nuclear reactors are running in Ontario, they'd probably say 2 or 3.
That's right.
Rather than the 20-ish that are kicking around.
I think that I think it would be fair to speculate that in general the public is not as familiar with the extent of nuclearization that's taken place in Ontario.
And, whenever pundits are talking about electricity, political pundits talking about electricity in Ontario, they're always trying to blame Wynne. And I say you'd have to believe that everything was perfect with Ontario Electric up until Ernie Eves in order for you to blame Wynne, rather than the PC policy by Bill Davis.
Yeah, he's the guy who did it first.
I don't want you to tip your hand, but on the other hand, you've written a written submission, I assume. So
I have,
and that is sort of public, and the commission gets advanced warning. But what is the general gist of what you're going to be presenting at the Pickering hearings?
At the Pickering hearing, our main focus is in 2 areas: decommissioning and how ready is OPG to begin. How ready are they for shutdown, and how ready are they for decommissioning? And the other main area is around security of the irradiated fuel. And it's in this aging facility. We, in the course of preparing for the Pickering hearing, went over the documents and found that there's even documented by OPG, the irradiated fuel bay is failing. A lot of their support equipment around the irradiated fuel bay is failing, and this reinforces concerns that we raised in the hearing around the Pickering Waste Management Facility license 1 year ago, where we really focused on security risks around the irradiated fuel and its transfer from the Pickering irradiated fuel bay to the Pickering Waste Management Facility. And there's a couple of really serious security risks, potential for breaches there. And then the management of that waste on the Pickering site. And, in our view, OPG has been far too slow. By our assessment, they've been far too slow in moving the irradiated fuel, the high-level waste, out of the pools into the dry storage. But in the case of Pickering, they have got a proposal on the table to build additional dry storage facilities, which is all for the good, except it's all for the bad, that they want to build these additional dry storage containers right on the edge of Lake Ontario, clear sight line from Ontario. So instead of doing what needs to be done, which is move the fuel out of the pools as rapidly as possible, and then move the dry storage containers into a more secure site. So back from the lake, more robust storage, and harden that storage. Instead, OPG wants to just carry on with more of the same, moving the waste out at a very slow pace, constructing more dry storage container buildings, which are very vulnerable because of their locating them next to Lake Ontario, which is then vulnerable not only to extreme weather events, but also to malevolent acts, so terrorist attacks.
And what about the Bruce refurb? Will you be able to make it there?
Yeah, and for the Bruce hearing, we're again focusing on waste and looking at condition of the waste storage. Again, some issues identified with the irradiated fuel bay, which was new to us. We knew that we've known for, I think it's been pretty well known for a long time that there's problems with the irradiated fuel bay at Pickering. We did not know until this review that there were problems with the irradiated fuel bay at Bruce. And then continued problems of, the continued failure of Bruce Power to properly account for the waste that they will generate and for the long-term isolation of that waste. Now, what Bruce likes to do is they like to say, well, that's OPG's problem.
Yeah.
OPG, Bruce leases the reactors from OPG. So they run the reactors, they generate the waste, and then they hand the waste over to OPG.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then OPG should be a co-proponent, and they should be accountable as well as Bruce for the waste generating. In our view, you can't have a licensing hearing without having some party at the table who's accountable for the waste. So that's our focus at Bruce.
Fascinating. So this is why they say go, 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 busy.
There's a lot on the go.
Jeepers creepers. There's not enough hearings for Northwatch, it seems.
Oh, there's enough hearings for Northwatch. So, we've got, we've got challenges of our own here in northeastern Ontario that, every hour we spend dealing with the problems created by Ontario's nuclear addiction are hours that we're not spending in our own region dealing with, our own challenges of northeastern Ontario. But what happened for us is you follow the chain backwards. We have for decades been threatened with the burial of the high-level waste. So we began intervening in the reactor licensing hearings to look at the waste issues, because we, and it turned out quite rightly, suspected that the reactor communities were simply being told the waste will go away. But as we entered into that discussion, we identified, some very serious issues with the radioactive waste, not just at the later stage when they try and ship it off and dump it on somebody else, but at the earlier stages in terms of the condition in which it's being stored or managed in the short term or intermediate term at the reactor station. And the way it is handled in the short term will affect how challenging it is to isolate it in the long term. So it's all connected, it's all one, it's all one continuum of risk when you're talking about radioactive waste.
One thing that's occurred to me recently, when you're talking about the Pickering decommissioning and how far off in the future that would be, so far off that it's too early to start estimating what's involved in the costs. And this is all under the guise that you can't mess with it until maybe decades have gone by for it to cool off. Here's the thing. But they're tearing apart Darlington as we speak. It was running not too long ago. There's no decades in waiting. Like when it comes to refurbing, there's no... Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how come you can't...
Oh, yeah, it's a total illogic.
Yeah.
So you can have worker exposure in the course of refurbishment is acceptable. Yeah. Worker exposure in the course of decommissioning is not acceptable. Well, I don't think worker exposure is acceptable at any point. And, I think that what we need to do is we need to have a really detailed discussion. I don't think we can say right now, well, what is the net benefit or disbenefit of beginning to dismantle those reactors in 10 years versus in 50 years. Certainly the industry gives us this line that, their main argument for why they want deep geological repositories is they say, well, the waste won't be safe on surface in times of social collapse. And, this is a point we made in the DGR hearing that where's the literature on this? Have they read a couple of science fiction books, that are dystopians or apocalyptic?
Or do they know something we don't know is the other.
Where's the evidence? But we can tell by their own estimates that social collapse is coming, but it's not coming for 50 years or 300 years, depending on, if they're going to build new reactors and they're going to take 20 years to build and they're going to run them for 30 years and they have to stand still then for 60 years. Well, social collapse, we haven't scheduled it in for another 100 years. But what's their evidence for that?
Right.
What's their evidence that, social collapse is going to occur with, and occur soon enough and fast enough that we have to get that waste stashed deep underground in a condition that it's then impossible to remediate or repackage or, respond to failures, because that's what a deep geological repository does, is it takes away your options for any future action.
And you can't monitor it or repackage it or vent it or anything.
You put it in the condition that makes any action as challenging as possible. So that's there. So their argument is social collapse is imminent enough that we have to rush into a decision now about where and how to bury it. But social collapse is not so imminent that we have to stop building reactors or we have to start their decommissioning so that we'll be done that job within the next 50 years. So where's the evidence? like, on what basis are they making these arguments? Because they completely run into each other.
Yeah.
And I think the same is the case with this. Decommissioning has to be deferred for 50 years because of, to reduce worker exposures, but those same worker exposures are acceptable in the case of refurbishment. Now, the one reason they can't completely decommission, as completely clear off a site, let alone the fact whether that's ever possible in terms of the radioactive contamination. But the one reason they can't clear off a site is because they don't have anywhere to put that radioactive waste. Mm-hmm. But they never say that's the reason, because they never want to fess up.
Right.
But they don't actually have any means of dealing with the waste other than stashing it and stacking it and waiting to see if some wish comes true in terms of their, dreams of deep burial.
Maybe they're hoping for economic collapse.
Maybe.
They'll be let off the hook.
That's right.
Well, I think there's something special about the nuclear industry in terms of illustrating this battle we have between the citizen and the corporation and government. I think there's no better example than nuclear. And it's probably just because the projects are so large that when there's people to skim off the top, would you rather to skim off the top of a small project or a multi-billion-dollar project?
Yeah. Well, and I think that the security issues mean that they often have a cover they can throw up and say, well, we can't give you that information because of security concerns. So they don't want to, for security reasons, they don't want to talk about, the method of transporting the irradiated fuel from one protected zone to another. But, it's pretty, you go out in a boat out on Lake Ontario, you can look in and you can see where it is. It's not, it's not a very big secret.
Also, they claim proprietary information. If you ask too specific a question, you can't get the answers.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Well, thank you again. I look forward to watching your presentations, as always. They're very informative.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good Sunday.
Bye-bye.
That was Brennain Lloyd from Northwatch. Northwatch is a member of Mining Watch Canada, Nuclear Waste Watch, and the Ontario Environment Network. Brennain Lloyd spoke to us from her home in North Bay.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
And I'm Brennain Lloyd in Northeastern Ontario.